The first time I saw Ezra Whitmore, he was kneeling in the herb garden behind the Millbrook Historical Society, his weathered hands coaxing life from stubborn soil. I'd moved to this forgotten corner of Vermont to escape the noise of everything. My failed relationship, my demanding job, my own thoughts that never seemed to quiet. Yet here was a man who seemed to have mastered silence itself. I was volunteering at the Historical Society, desperate for something to fill my days that didn't involve staring at my laptop screen. Mrs. Caldwell, the Society's director, had mentioned their groundskeeper was a bit peculiar, but hadn't elaborated. Watching Ezra work, I understood what she meant. He moved with deliberate precision, each gesture purposeful, each moment of stillness intentional. He looked up when my shadow fell across his workspace, and I felt something shift in my chest. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and though his lips remained sealed, I sensed volumes in that gaze. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair that fell just past his collar, and hands that spoke of years spent coaxing beauty from the earth. "I'm Rowan," I said, extending my hand. "I'll be helping with the archive project." He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth before taking mine. His grip was firm, calloused. He held my gaze for a moment that stretched like taffy, then nodded once. A single, perfect acknowledgement that somehow conveyed more than most people managed with 1,000 words. That night, I found myself thinking about those storm cloud eyes and wondering what stories lived behind them. Over the following weeks, I discovered that Ezra's silence wasn't empty, it was full. He communicated through the angle of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the careful placement of his hands. When I struggled with a particularly stubborn archive box, he appeared beside me, wordlessly taking the weight. When I worked late into the evening, he'd leave a thermos of coffee on my desk, still warm, with a single wildflower resting beside it. I began to learn his rhythms. Morning coffee at 6:30 sharp, always black. Lunch eaten in the garden, usually a simple sandwich from home. Evenings spent reading in the old carriage house that had been converted into his apartment. I'd glimpse him through the window sometimes, glasses perched on his nose, lost in whatever book held his attention. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to his ways. "Ezra's been like that since he came here," Martha from the general store told me. 8 years now. Never heard him say a word, but he's the kindest man you'll ever meet. Fixed my porch steps without being asked, tends to old man Peterson's garden when his arthritis flares up. I started bringing my lunch to the garden, sitting on the wooden bench he'd built beneath the apple tree. At first, he'd glance up, nod, then return to his work. But gradually, he began to linger. He'd show me the progress of the tomatoes, the way the morning glories climbed their trellis, the intricate pattern of a spider's web heavy with dew. One afternoon, as I struggled to open a particularly stubborn jar of pickles in the break room, Ezra appeared. He gently took the jar from my hands, his fingers brushing mine in a way that sent electricity up my arms. The jar opened with a soft pop, and as he handed it back, our eyes met. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that space between us, charged with possibility. "Thank you," I whispered, and he smiled. A real smile that transformed his entire face. It was the first time I'd seen him truly smile, and it stole my breath. The third week of September brought the first real storm of the season. I was working late, trying to finish cataloging a collection of Civil War letters, when the lights flickered and died. The Historical Society's old electrical system had always been temperamental, but in the darkness, with rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the valley, I felt suddenly, completely alone. Then a warm glow appeared in the doorway. Ezra stood there holding an oil lamp, its light casting dancing shadows across his face. He'd changed from his usual work clothes into dark jeans and a cable-knit sweater that made his eyes look even more like storm clouds. He gestured toward the door, and I understood, time to go. But as we stepped outside, the wind caught the door, slamming it shut with a finality that made my stomach drop. The keys were inside, along with my phone and car keys. The rain soaked through my thin cardigan in seconds, and I was shivering before we'd even reached the street. Without hesitation, Ezra shrugged out of his jacket and draped it around my shoulders. It smelled like wood smoke and fresh earth and something indefinably him. He tilted his head toward the carriage house, a question in his eyes. I nodded, and he led me through the garden, his hands steady on my elbow as we navigated the rain-slicked path. The carriage house was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of old wood and books. A fire crackled in the small fireplace, and bookcases lined every wall. He guided me to a chair by the fire, then disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen. He returned with a towel and a steaming mug of something that smelled like cinnamon and honey. As I sipped the warming drink, I studied his space. The books were an eclectic mix: poetry, philosophy, gardening manuals, classic literature. A chess set sat on a small table, the pieces worn smooth from use. Everything was precisely arranged, but it felt lived-in, comfortable. "This is beautiful," I said, and he ducked his head in what might have been embarrassment or pleasure. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The fire painted everything in warm gold, and I found myself watching the way the light played across his features. When he caught me staring, I didn't look away. Something had shifted between us, some invisible barrier dissolving like sugar in rain. The storm passed, but something had changed. Ezra began including me in his daily routines. He'd gesture for me to join him in the garden, showing me how to tell when the soil was ready for planting, how to prune the roses without damaging next year's blooms. His hands would cover mine, guiding my movements, and I'd lose myself in the warmth of his touch. He taught me to read the sky, to predict weather by the way the light fell across the mountains. He showed me which herbs could soothe a headache, which flowers attracted butterflies, which vegetables grew best in the shadow of the old oak tree. Every lesson was delivered in silence, but I understood perfectly. One evening, as we worked side by side preparing the garden for winter, I finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my chest for weeks. "Why don't you speak?" He stilled, his hands pausing in their work. For a moment, I thought he might not answer at all. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. He wrote carefully, his handwriting neat and precise, then handed it to me. Words failed me once when I needed them most. I found peace in the quiet. I studied his face, seeing pain there, old and deep. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He shook his head, then wrote again, "Don't be." It brought me here. To this garden. To you. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked up to find him watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. The space between us seemed to crackle with possibility. "Ezra," I breathed, and he stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He raised his hand, hesitating just inches from my face. I leaned into his touch, and his palm curved against my cheek with a tenderness that made my eyes sting. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, and I felt like I was coming apart and being rebuilt all at once. October painted the world in fire. The maples around Millbrook blazed scarlet and gold, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. I'd been in Vermont for 2 months now, and the peace I'd been seeking had found me, but it wore Ezra's face. We developed a routine of evening walks through the town, past the covered bridge that spanned Miller's Creek, up the hill to the old cemetery where weathered headstones told stories of lives long past. Ezra would point out details I'd missed, the way the light fell through the trees, the intricate carving on a particular monument, the family of deer that grazed in the meadow beyond. On this particular evening, we'd climbed higher than usual, to a spot where the whole valley spread out below us like a patchwork quilt. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. I was so absorbed in the view that I almost missed Ezra pulling out his notebook. "I need to tell you something," he'd written. I turned to face him fully, my heart already racing. He was nervous. I could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly, the way he kept glancing at me and then away. "I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time," the next line read. "You make me want to try again." "Try what again?" I asked softly. He wrote carefully, then showed me, everything. Trusting. Hoping. Loving. The word hung between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I reached out, covering his hand with mine. "Ezra," I whispered, and he looked up, his eyes vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said, and watched the transformation in his face, surprise giving way to wonder, then to something deeper, more intense. He set the notebook aside and cupped my face in both hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of my cheeks. I leaned into his touch, and he rested his forehead against mine. We breathed the same air, shared the same space, and I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the stars began to appear, he took my hand and led me back down the hill, but something fundamental had changed. The silence between us was no longer empty space. It was full of promises and possibilities, of love declared and received. The first snow came early that year, dusting the world in white overnight. I woke in my small rented room above the bakery to find Ezra outside my window, building a snowman in the small courtyard. He looked up when I appeared, his face bright with unexpected mischief, and beckoned me down. I threw on clothes and boots and rushed outside, laughing as he pelted me with a perfectly formed snowball. We built snow sculptures until our fingers were numb, then retreated to the carriage house for hot chocolate and the warmth of the fire. Something was different about Ezra that day. He seemed lighter, more present, as if some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When I commented on it, he reached for his notebook, then stopped. His mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging, but I could see the struggle in his eyes. "It's okay," I said, moving closer. "Whatever it is, however you need to say it, it's okay." He took a shaky breath, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was rusty from disuse, barely above a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I want to tell you about before." I nodded, not trusting my voice, afraid that any sound might break the spell. I was a teacher," he continued, each word careful and deliberate. "High school English. I loved it. Loved the kids, loved the books, loved talking about ideas." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering strength. I waited, patient as stone. "There was an accident. One of my students, Sarah. She was struggling and I said all the wrong things. She." His voice broke and I reached for his hand. "She took her own life," he finished, the words falling like stones into still water. "Her parents blamed me. Said I failed her. Said my words, said what I said." I squeezed his hand, and he looked up at me with eyes full of old pain. I stopped talking that day. Couldn't trust myself anymore. Couldn't risk hurting someone else with words. "Oh, Ezra," I whispered, and he leaned into me, letting me hold him as he shook with years of suppressed grief. "But you," he said, his voice growing stronger, "you make me want to try again. You make me believe that maybe I can find the right words." I pulled back to look at him, my heart breaking and healing all at once. "You've been finding the right words all along," I told him. "Just not with your voice." He smiled then, tremulous but real, and when he kissed me, it tasted like new beginnings and old wounds finally healing. Later, as we lay tangled in his sheets, the moonlight streaming through the windows, he traced patterns on my bare shoulder with his fingertips. "I never thought I'd find this again," he murmured. "This kind of love, this kind of peace." I turned in his arms, studying his face in the silver light. "You taught me that love doesn't always need words," I said. "Sometimes it's just presence. Being fully with someone." He smiled, that transformative smile that had first stolen my breath. "You taught me that words can heal as well as hurt," he replied. "That silence and speech can exist together, can strengthen each other." As sleep began to claim us, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, from that first meeting in the garden to this moment of perfect intimacy. I'd come to Millbrook seeking quiet, but I'd found something infinitely more precious. A love that spoke in every language, a man who'd shown me that the deepest truths are often felt rather than spoken. Outside, the night was full of the sounds of spring, crickets singing, wind through new leaves, the distant call of an owl. But inside, in the circle of Ezra's arms, there was perfect peace. We'd found our way to each other across the distance of words and silence, and I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. In the morning, I would wake to find him already up, making coffee and humming softly to himself, the first time I'd ever heard him make any sound just for the joy of it. And I would know, with complete certainty, that I was exactly where I belonged.